It happened 3 summers ago, but I still think about it every time I'm alone at night. My family owns a small cabin up in northern Michigan, nestled deep in the woods near a lake. It's peaceful, quiet, exactly the kind of place people go to escape the noise of everyday life. But after that night, I realized some things in the quiet are better left undiscovered. I was 17 at the time, and my parents had finally agreed to let me spend a weekend at the cabin alone. I'd been there dozens of times before, but always with family. This was the first time I'd ever had the place to myself. No curfews, no rules, just me, the lake, and my old beater of a car parked outside. The first night was perfect. I grilled burgers, listened to music, and sat on the back porch watching fireflies blink in the distance. The cabin was surrounded by woods on 3 sides, with the lake on the 4th. At night, the trees turned into an endless black void, stretching on forever. At around midnight, I decided to go to bed. I had left one of the windows cracked to let in the cool night air, and as I lay in bed, I listened to the sounds of the forest, the distant call of an owl, the rustling of leaves. It was peaceful, but then I heard something else. Footsteps. Not the light scattered steps of an animal, but slow, deliberate ones. Human footsteps. I held my breath, listening. They were coming from the woods behind the cabin. My first thought was that maybe a hiker had gotten lost. But who would be hiking out here in the middle of the night? I sat up, heart pounding, and reached for my phone. I turned the flashlight on and pointed it at the window, but all I could see were the trees swaying in the breeze. The footsteps had stopped. I told myself it was my imagination, or maybe a deer passing through. But then, just as I started to relax, I heard something even worse. A whisper. It was faint, almost carried by the wind, but I swear I heard it. A man's voice, murmuring something just beyond my window. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent ice through my veins. It was low, breathy, almost amused. I grabbed the knife I had brought for cooking and stood up. My heart was racing so hard I could hear it in my ears. I walked to the window and peered out, but there was nothing. The woods were still empty. Then the whisper came again. This time it was closer. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing in the cabin with me, but I was alone. I ran to the front door and made sure it was locked. The windows too. I turned off every light and sat in the darkness, knife clutched in my hand, listening. For the next hour, nothing happened. No footsteps, no whispers. Just the endless night stretching on outside. I started to convince myself that maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But then, right before dawn, I heard the whisper again, right outside my bedroom window. This time, I understood what it said. I see you. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The moment the sun came up, I grabbed my things, threw them in the car, and drove straight home. I never told my parents the full story, just that I'd gotten spooked and didn't want to stay alone again. They laughed it off, said I was just being paranoid. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was just my imagination. But then, a few weeks later, my dad went up to the cabin alone to do some maintenance. When he came back, he asked me something that still makes my skin crawl to this day. "Did you leave the back window unlocked?" I shook my head. I had checked every single window before I left. He frowned. "That's weird. It was wide open when I got there." I used to love summer. The long days, the warmth, the feeling of freedom. But after what happened last year, I don't think I'll ever look at summer the same way again. My friend Jake's family owned an old lake house deep in the woods, miles away from any town. It was one of those places that felt like it had been frozen in time. Wooden furniture, dim lanterns, the faint smell of mildew in every corner. There was no Wi-Fi, barely any cell service, and at night, the only sounds were the water lapping against the shore and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was just me, Jake, his cousin Evan, and our friend Matt. We had planned a weekend of fishing, swimming, and just getting away from everything. It was supposed to be fun. The first night was normal. We grilled burgers, played poker, and told stupid stories around the fire. Around midnight, Evan and Matt went inside, leaving just me and Jake staring into the flames. That's when I saw it, something moving at the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it was just a deer, but then I realized how tall it was. It stood just beyond the glow of our fire, barely visible, but I could make out its shape, thin, unnaturally tall, just standing there, watching. I nudged Jake. "You see that?" He squinted into the dark, but by the time he looked, the figure was gone. "Dude, you're just drunk," he laughed, tossing another log into the fire. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't help the feeling that something was out there, watching. That night I barely slept. The old wooden cabin creaked and groaned with the wind, but around 3 a.m., I heard something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, right outside my window. I held my breath, staring at the ceiling, hoping I was imagining it. But then I heard the sound of something tapping against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I turned over slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The window was small, just above my bed, and for a split second I saw it. A face, pale, hollow eyes, staring at me through the glass. I shot up and scrambled to turn on my flashlight, but by the time I did, it was gone. The next morning, I told the guys what happened. "Probably just an animal," Matt shrugged. "Yeah, man, these woods are full of weird sounds at night," Jake added. But Evan looked uncomfortable. "My uncle used to say something about this place," he muttered. "He said there's something out here, something that watches." We all laughed it off, but I could tell that he wasn't joking. That evening, we went swimming in the lake. The water was cold, but refreshing. The sun was just starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. We were joking around when Matt suddenly stopped. "Dude, where's Jake?" I turned, scanning the water. No sign of him. My stomach dropped. Then, out of nowhere, he surfaced, gasping, coughing, eyes wide with panic. "What the hell happened?" I yelled, swimming toward him. He clawed at my arm, shaking. Something pulled me under. We got him back to shore, and he just sat there shivering, staring at the water. "There was a hand," he whispered. "It grabbed my ankle." We packed our bags that night. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were scared. Something was out there. Before we left the next morning, I took one last look at the lake. The water was still, reflecting the trees like a mirror. But then, I saw it. A figure standing beneath the surface, barely visible, staring up at me. We never went back. Every summer, my family rented a cabin in a quiet, wooded area near Hollow Lake. It was a tradition. My parents, my younger brother Ethan and I, would spend a week fishing, swimming, and roasting marshmallows under the stars. But the summer when I was 17 was the last time we ever went. The cabin was old, with creaky floors and a musty smell that never quite faded. It sat at the edge of the lake, surrounded by thick trees that made it feel isolated. I usually liked that until the third night. That evening, my parents had gone into town to get groceries, leaving me in charge of Ethan. He was only 10 at the time, full of energy and easily scared. As the sun dipped below the trees, he insisted on playing by the water one last time before bed. I sat on the dock, scrolling through my phone, occasionally glancing up to make sure he wasn't getting too close to the deep end. Then he stopped. He stood motionless at the shoreline, staring into the trees across the lake. The hairs on my arms stood up before I even saw what he was looking at. There was a figure standing just beyond the tree line. I couldn't make out any details, just a tall, shadowy shape. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fading light, but then it moved. It took a slow, deliberate step forward, but something about the way it moved was wrong, too fluid, like it was gliding instead of walking. "Ethan, come here," I said, keeping my voice calm. He didn't move. "Ethan," I said more firmly. He finally turned, his eyes wide, and ran to me. I grabbed his wrist and pulled him toward the cabin. I didn't want to look back, but I couldn't help myself. The figure was gone. We locked the doors and closed all the curtains. I tried to act like it was nothing, like maybe it was just a trick of the light or some random hiker. But Ethan wasn't convinced. He refused to sleep alone, so I let him crash in my room. I don't know what time I woke up, but something was off. The room was too quiet. The usual hum of crickets and distant owls was gone. My breath felt loud in my ears as I strained to hear anything. Then, tap, tap, tap. A soft, deliberate knock at the window. I held my breath. My bed was positioned across from the window, and the curtains were thin. Moonlight spilled into the room, just enough for me to see a silhouette standing right outside. I thought my heart had stopped. It was tall. Its head nearly touched the top of the window. But the worst part? Fingers. Long, spindly fingers tapping against the glass. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then Ethan stirred. He let out a sleepy mumble and shifted under the blankets. The thing outside tilted its head, as if it had heard him. I don't know what came over me, but I finally snapped out of my paralysis. I lunged for Ethan, clamping a hand over his mouth before he could make another sound. My other hand reached for my phone. The second I turned on the flashlight, the figure vanished. Not like it ran or ducked. It was just gone. I stayed awake until my parents got home. I didn't tell them. They wouldn't believe me. But Ethan, he knew. The next morning, we found footprints in the damp earth beneath the window. Long, thin footprints that weren't human. We left 2 days early. That was the last summer we ever spent at Hollow Lake.